Good evening, everyone. We're going to share our screen as we do, and we will jump right into our work. This is our fourth session looking at the social and cultural development of the United States after the Civil War, and that period of time, really between the wars, we could even say. We will not focus on World War I, but we will be looking at the years leading right up, to that moment. When things were kind of changing. And what we are really discussing is how the experience of what it meant to be a citizen in the country after the war shifted. When you teach the class that I teach, and you teach the American History Starting Out series, so the first half up through the Civil War. So that's colonization, founding the country through the Civil War. And then when you teach the modern class, it's even as you teach it, you can sense you're almost talking about two separate countries. And certainly as you stand in modern times, and even before this crazy year, so in say 2018 or 2015 or 2012, and you would teach, you would sense very clearly how different the country is today compared to when it started. In fact, I will tell students when we talk about American History 2020 that we're going to spend this whole class trying to understand why the country looks the way it looks. Why is it this way? Why do we have the things that we have and have the experiences that we've had? Who's here, the government that we have, the structure, the technology, the consumerism, capitalism, all those pieces. And so if you were taking the course and you were taking them both simultaneously, it'd be really almost like schizophrenic or almost kind of bipolar, because you'd have one set of values and one set of focuses in the early development. So from colonization to the founding, the early founding. I'm reading a book right now about the Constitution. I've taught you guys about the Constitution, but I love learning. I'm always trying to, get more. And just thinking as these people talk about their ideas of like founding the country and then living in our time now, modern time, say the past, 30 years, it is diametrically different. Well, this period here is the moment when that change really happens. The country that comes out of World War I, the country that comes out of the development of this kind of transformative period of say 30 to 50 years, is a radically different country in its people than it was when we started. And we've seen that as we've kind of gone along. So what do we see, right? So the war has been kind of threw some questions at the country about many aspects. And as we talked about it, we've noticed that there was the coming of industry. So the capitalism exploded at a level that literally transformed society. We noticed that this then led to two major issues that had not previously been a problem in the country. What to do with the worker who had left the farm. Remember, the old idea of the American dream was I have my own independence, and that was almost always centered in I have land upon which I feed myself, and I can live without necessarily having or needing any money at all. And so that transformed, right? As people went to the cities, you couldn't do that. And so now I spent my day earning a salary of some kind. And so is that enough money? And then that also then tweaks itself into the creation and the rise of people coming to the cities. So that was the secondary thing that emerged coming out of industry. And then with Dr. Bryson last week, we talked about how then this began to raise the question of civil rights. And that's going to be our look tonight, is more about civil rights. So last week and this week, really talking about civil rights. Heather spent the time talking about what was going on for women, what was going on for how women were excluded, but then continued to kind of push. We know that we're celebrating this very election in November of 2020, the centennial of women finally getting to vote legally across the entirety of the country in the 1920 election. And so, it was appropriate, I thought, for Heather to come and to lead that conversation. Now, all of this then, as I've described before, kind of like putting on a suit of clothes that don't fit exactly right. Maybe I've gained too much weight. Maybe I've lost some weight. Something's happened that the clothes don't fit right. And you guys know that feeling. And that's exactly how I describe the country at this moment. We could add a bullet point just about the West itself, although I didn't talk about the West in detail because really the West deserves like its own series. I'm just not the professor to do it because it's not my area of expertise, but we could do a 4 or 6 week or 8 week look at the West developing after the war. And in one sense, you can think of how the map of the country looks, and then that Western half was largely empty. So there's a whole different aspect of development. We mentioned it somewhat as we looked at some of the pieces. The railroad, a key piece. Industry, the idea of monopoly happens in the West as well with the Western industries. So the whole country is kind of feeling this situation. And so now, then this leads us today to civil rights, and that will take us back to Reconstruction. So I told you when we did the Civil War, we were not going to focus on Reconstruction, but that we would look at it briefly. And this is the moment we're going to look at it briefly, because you have to remember what happens in the contextual journey. Remember, history is a long narrative, and to understand my now, I have to understand the moments that came before. Sometimes it's the moments of the past 2 or 5 years, but often to really get a good grasp, it's 20, 40, 60, 100 years back. And so Reconstruction and its challenges, or maybe its failures, they continued to haunt the country and the South specifically, largely because the main goals were never met, right? So these are the 3 main goals: political reunification. And when I say reunification, I don't mean just they became part of the country again, but that the South played a role. If you look at the leadership, the national leadership of the country, all the way through the Civil War, the vast majority of that was from the South. All but I think 2 of the presidents or 3 of the presidents were from the South. Most of those who weren't from the South, such as Buchanan from Pennsylvania, we would call them allies of the South. I used to know this statistic, but I want to say it's about 75 to 80% of the cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, leaders in the military were all Southern. Now, some of that is because of the 3/5 compromise and the decision that was made in building the Constitution. But be that as it may, ultimately, the South perceived itself as leaders. So there's a sense in which we want to reunify the country and, kind of have the South matter again. Economic diversification, and then, of course, civil rights. Well, those were not accomplished in the time of Reconstruction, and we noted somewhat what happened with Reconstruction. Literally, you could sort of say that when these were accomplished, and some might argue they're still not really accomplished. You all remember when President Carter was elected in '76, that was the first time that a Southerner had a major role to play in the country, particularly at the national leadership, since the time of the Civil War. The economic diversification in the South does not happen until the Sun Belt in the late 80s and into the 90s, which we've lived through obviously recently. And then from a civil rights point of view, obviously the election of President Obama was a key moment that I think possibly, I would suggest, is evidence of the civil rights acceptance. But clearly we can see in our own day that there are many who would disagree, and they would say still not yet. As far as what they would expect or how they would define the idea of civil rights acceptance. So when you look at Reconstruction, you say, well, what in the world happened? Well, you remember how Reconstruction was altered or changed around this idea of civil rights, and that was really principally demonstrated to us by the 14th Amendment. And you've seen this slide before. I've showed you this slide before, but we have to go back here to understand the idea, even say of what should the right of the worker be? What should that worker, the person who works in the industry, what should their rights be? Ultimately leans back on the idea that they have a set of rights. Now, again, if you study American History 1 with me, so the course that goes through the Civil War, literally at no point does anybody ever talk about the idea of rights in the sense of civil rights. Certainly there's the Bill of Rights, and then in the time of the Revolution, there's the fight around the Declaration of Rights, and looking back to the English Bill of Rights, which is really their constitution. But this idea that there's rights inherent to me as an individual, as a civilian, really was not something that was discussed. And so it's highlighted here at the 14th Amendment. Now, you remember, you have to put the 13th, 14th, and as we're about to see, 15th Amendment in context together as the Republican Party, which was the Abolition Party, desperately trying to find a way to accomplish that third goal, to acceptance of civil rights. The hope had been, if you free the slaves and then you allow them access to normal life, well, they'll have the same opportunities as everybody else. And if they don't have it, then that's nobody's fault necessarily. But what we saw happening in those first 3 or 4 years of Reconstruction was an intentional effort by Southerners to limit or deny or to keep away from any sense of equality or opportunity for the former slaves. So this really is what led to the 14th Amendment, which, as we noted, changed the understanding of the Constitution. The Constitution had been written to empower the federal government, but then the Bill of Rights and the understanding of how the Constitution was worked out over those next 80-something years was to not let it have free power. So it would limit itself. And of course, you know, the Bill of Rights starts with, Congress shall make no law. So this idea of limiting or kind of binding what had become a more powerful government. Well, now with the 14th Amendment, what the Republicans want to do is set in motion a way in which the government can act as the defender of people who are trying to find their way for their freedoms. So this is all happening in the economic development of the South. We've seen this slide of this information before, but just to remind you, the South was having some of the diversification, but it was not happening in a way that spread broadly for all people in the South, and in particular, not for the former slaves, for the freedmen. So even though you do have some growth happening, the majority of life and economics in the South stayed on the farm. The agricultural world. Going into the Civil War, the South by itself would have been the 3rd or 4th richest nation in the world. And that was principally focused on cotton, although not only on cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice. Those were kind of the cash crops of the South. And they obviously, the cotton kings in particular, but the rice kings, the tobacco kings, they wanted to continue having this economic situation. So for that to happen, they needed workers. And the most logical workers for them to have were the former slaves. So you don't really have an opportunity happening to really create a new South, no matter how badly Mr. Grady wanted to kind of think this was the case. And so this, again, highlights for us what was happening in this realm of civil rights. So the empowered federal government attempts to try to solve this through the Freedmen's Bureau. What they wanted to do was to have some representatives of the government able to go and coordinate kind of the interactions between the white people and the black people, the former slave masters and the former slaves. Now, they were backed initially by the Union Army. So you can imagine that that's not going to help things out. Unfortunately, what happens is when President Johnson moves quickly to release land back to the former owners, this ultimately limits the African Americans. You may remember when we looked at the end of the Civil War, I showed you a slide, I should show it to you here. Now when General Sherman made his way to Savannah, he instituted what became known as 40 acres and a mule, whereby the Union Army had taken land from these people who had rebelled, so were traitors to the country, and had offered up to 40 acres to any slave family who wanted it, along with the mule to work the land. Well, fast forward two and a half years, President Johnson gives the land back to the rightful owners. Now, from a sense of understanding the law about property, you go, okay, I get that. But from an understanding of what happens with civil rights, you can clearly see that this then would limit what the opportunities were for the former slaves. They, in many cases, had spent up to 2 years on land and were developing, quite honestly, thriving communities, and now that land was taken from them. So then what they were left with was what became known as sharecropping. And the idea of sharecropping, it's not all bad necessarily, and for some of the slaves, it worked out well because it allowed them the independence to choose, when they planted, when they worked, kind of where they worked. But in general terms, it's usually seen as a negative form of economic tyranny's too strong. You can see there one of the quotes that many historians have used, that it was slavery without the chains. What made it so bad was that in general terms, the slaves were uneducated. So things about loans, interest rates, payment time, all that was sort of lost on somebody who didn't have the education. So you can imagine somebody able to go in and construct a contract. In many cases, they would sell them the seed, they would sell them tools, they would sell them mechanical instruments to work the land. And then because they couldn't be paid off immediately, they were kind of added into what you owed. And it just became this kind of spiraling debt cycle. This is really one of the most damaging aspects of what happens in Reconstruction, and sets the stage for our own day. When you hear people talking about things such as reparations, or the question of kind of poverty legacy that is not just for former African-American slaves, but for many people, the idea that being impoverished kind of goes generationally to generation because it becomes difficult to get out of, particularly if you don't have the land. This becomes part of the process. This is kind of that descriptive moment that there's not really a way for a person to help their descendants gain a step forward if they themselves never have the land. And in most cases, the slaves could not ever purchase the land. So of course, education, as I just mentioned, becomes a central focus of the Freedmen's Bureau. If we can help people be educated, it'd be positive. And this is one of the most vital moments of understanding kind of what happens both in the Southern development, but also in the development of civil rights. So we, hopefully all of you, would say that education is a positive thing. And so here was the government coming in to build schools and fund educators. Thousands of people came to teach. Most were from the North. They built schools for both white and black kids, almost always separate, so segregated, just trying to avoid any major issues. They actually built more schools, the Freedmen's Bureau did, for white children than they did for the former slaves. However, these were largely opposed almost all the time. They were opposed for a variety of reasons. Racism certainly was at the center of it as it related to African Americans being taught. As you would remember, hopefully, and you look in the 1870s, you're talking just a decade before, it was illegal to teach an African American or a slave to read or write. And so you can imagine amongst the white South in this time of this tension of Reconstruction, thinking to themselves, I don't want to spend any money on allowing an African American to know how to read. Why do they need to know that? All they need to do is work the fields. But by the same token, there was also a historical aversion in the South, a Jeffersonian view about taxation that also limited their desire to support. Of course, as you and I know, schools are paid for by the whole community through taxes of some type. And so you can see in the South, in which already had an aversion against the North in general, and then a larger, deeper Jeffersonian view that all taxation or most taxation was bad, they would be opposing that. So then here comes this new law to say you're going to pay taxes that is going to fund schools. Well, then that just becomes an anathema for them. And it wasn't just that they didn't want to pay for schools for the little black children, though that was the case, but they also didn't want to pay for it for their own children. So it wasn't as if their opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau schools was only aimed at the former slaves, but it was aimed at other schools as well. There you see the picture of the burning of the school, and that's certainly the burning of a freedmen's school. But many poor whites also avoided that. They didn't want to quote, some damn Yankee teaching my kid how to think. They wanted my child to learn how to do the things they had always historically done. For the women, in the kitchen, running the household. For the young men, for the boys, learning how to shoot, to hunt, and to farm. You may remember the TV show, The Beverly Hillbillies, which was centered starting near East Tennessee, where I'm from. Of course, they go out to Hollywood, and the whole joke of it, if you remember, is that Jethro was the most educated one because he had made it to the 6th grade, and how Uncle Jed would often talk about, well, Jethro maybe knows more. Of course, you watch the show, you realize Jethro was not the most smart one. Actually, Uncle Jed probably was the uneducated one. But that plays off stereotypes, both of the South in general as a rule, in a backward and uneducated kind of society, but it also played on the history of what really happened in the South. So when you have this kind of situation going on, then you then end up with Reconstruction becoming this turmoil in which at the center of it was how the former slaves were treated. And so at all levels, you begin to see massive opposition to anything being done in Reconstruction that ultimately would be designed to change the fabric of life in the South. And it is from this that you ultimately end up with, as we'll see in a moment, the myth of the lost cause. So in general terms, there becomes an open opposition. There were actually codes or laws developed by cities and states that were specifically aimed at limiting any rights to former slaves. There were also efforts against any support of any white person who would try to support slaves or join ultimately politically with them, typically in the Republican Party. So you kind of end up with this series of laws and developments occurring in the South that limited any real opportunity. Now, I want to hasten to say that as we go forward, we'll find that many of these ideas and these sense of codes or laws created by states will move north as African Americans attempt to move north. Initially, of course, most slaves stayed right where they were, or former slaves, because largely they wouldn't know anybody else. They wouldn't know where to go or really have any opportunity to go. It wouldn't be easy to just pack up and move somewhere. It will be about 40 years before they begin making what becomes known as the Great Migration north, largely at the Mississippi River, to Chicago, and then into New York. And when they get there, in places like St. Louis and Cincinnati, in Cleveland, in Chicago, they'll find some of the same kind of rules designed to either separate the races or limit the races as they went along. Well, this ultimately will lead the Republicans to try one last moment, and this becomes a critical aspect of the journey about civil rights. And that was to say, we've got to make sure that these new citizens will be allowed to participate in the suffrage movement. They'll be allowed to vote. And of course, Heather talked about this last week, when we looked at the 15th Amendment, which Congress passes in 69. They start talking about it in 68 after Grant's election, but they don't ratify it till February of 1870. But what this is, well, what James Madison would have told us would be that it wouldn't be necessary. In other words, once we establish these people as citizens with the 14th Amendment, then you shouldn't need a specific amendment to state they have the right to vote, because, ergo, as a citizen, they should get to vote. And here you can see in the 15th Amendment clearly that idea of how the government has shifted because of the 14th Amendment. Because the 15th Amendment is a statement specifically at the states saying, in other words, they're citizens. You cannot prohibit them from voting. So the 15th Amendment does not somehow expand upon what government should do, or tell us some aspect about government, such as freedom of speech or something like that. But it's specifically stating you can't deny these people the right to vote. So this was a positive move, and it does lead down the road towards a more open society. But not surprisingly, it's met with opposition throughout the South. In what becomes known as the First Mississippi Plan, violence will be used specifically against anybody voting who would not vote, in other words, for the old ways, which ultimately becomes principally demonstrated in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, which of course was established by Andrew Jackson, but had its roots back to Jefferson, was now becoming to be seen as the white man's party, the party of only white people, defending the historic views of how things are supposed to be. And so all across the South, white supremacy groups began to emerge. Now, the Klan is the most famous, but they're really the most famous because of what happens in the 1920s, which we won't talk about tonight. The Klan at this point was just one of the groups that emerges at this time. So they're regional groups, but they all generally had the same basic idea, which was a viewpoint of how society should operate. They did not see themselves as opponents of the law. They saw themselves as protectors of the law. Now, obviously, most of us today look at these groups and we see them as either directly terrorist groups or certainly groups that did not and do not support civil rights. But it's important for us, you know, as a historian to try to say, well, let's just stand and sort of see how do they see the world. The way I tell my students, which is I know a little provocative, is you've got to put on that hood of the Klan and try to say, why would they do this? It's too easy to simply suggest, well, they're hateful or they hate people. Certainly many of the acts, lynching, the beatings, the attacks are despicable and horrific and deserve our censor. But at the same time, we kind of want to say, what would make somebody do that? Why would they get there? And again, it's this response to things like the 15th Amendment that kind of drives this down the road. So Grant tries really his last thing, which is to try to destroy the Klan, specifically in one place that it was most famous in South Carolina. So now we're back to South Carolina. And he does. He's able to arrest many citizens, civic leaders, put them on trial, and have them arrested, many spending time in jail, prolonged periods of time in jail, for actions that had accrued over the last, say, 5 or 6 years in Reconstruction. And it works. The Klan largely disappears from the scene until we get to the late 1919 period, 1918 period, by some choices that President Wilson makes. So it works, but it doesn't really work the way that we would have wished. And again, we're just trying to say, well, what happens to civil rights? Why does it get so bad? Well, it gets so bad because of all these things that happen in Reconstruction. So the opposite effect happened in that Northern people, remember I told you how Grant said we just didn't do Reconstruction long enough. Northern voters, Republican voters who voted for Grant, kind of grew to the point where they had had enough. They thought, well, we freed the slaves, we've set them back on their feet, we've got things, we're paying money to rebuild the destroyed cities of the South like Atlanta or Vicksburg, so it's not our problem anymore. And there were other things that were occurring in the country, most specifically the economic depression that occurs in 73, 72, 74, that really would get people in the North not interested. But they didn't like reading about the violence. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to look at it. And it's that idea of I can hide myself from it that actually doomed Reconstruction, because at the same time they're doing that, Southern leaders begin to realize we're better off if we're not so open in our violence and we kind of hide our way in, even though violence remained still a key part. And the Colfax massacre occurs in Louisiana the year after Grant goes after the Klan. And here you have a gathering of white supremacy leaders, almost all Democratic Party activists, who roll into Louisiana, in this part of Louisiana, and openly shot in the streets African Americans and even some white Republican voters. So this obviously begins to kind of have a dampening effect on the vote. You can see there the 73 and the 75 voting totals in Mississippi. And clearly in 73, between 73 and 75, people who were going to vote Republican, both slaves and white people, heard the lesson. They kind of got the message to get out, to be careful in that how you would vote. And it would take an extraordinarily brave person. I mean, I would like to find the 7 people who voted for the Republican Party just to find out who these brave people were. This is why, and of course you and I have lived through this over the past 100 years, actually now 150 years into the 20s, we'll still hear of elections come November of the second or the third time somebody was elected as a Republican in a certain city somewhere in the South. That's all because of kind of this movement of Reconstruction to squash any opportunity for civil rights. As this begins to go forward, you then end up in a setting where rights for the freedmen becomes almost impossible. And after the 1877 compromise that ended officially Reconstruction, in which the North or the Union Army was removed from the last states and control was given back to this group who we call them the New Departure Democrats, or they're often called the Redeemers. And what these leaders recognized was that we, the Democratic Party who lives here in Alabama or Florida or Georgia or Tennessee, we can run things if the Union Army and the Freedmen's Bureau leaders are out. And we'll get them out if we can play by the rules till they're gone. then once they're gone, we can kind of do what we want. And that's precisely what they did. They were aided through their efforts at both violence and attacking any voting opportunities. So if you can eliminate the other side that might vote through threat, through violence, then you basically have the freedom to construct whatever system you want. They moved away from too much open violence in the voting area, although as you can see in that one drawing down there at the bottom, remember voting was done in the open until around the 1920s. So today we'll go to vote and you can't even have, you know, somebody come with you to stand beside you. The voting people who volunteer at the voting centers will say, no, that person can't be with you, because you're supposed to vote in isolation. You get the freedom to have nobody looking at your ballot. That's a late addition. That's only been about 100 years. So clearly, if you were in a setting where a group of people wanted to influence how the vote would happen, it became easy to do that. But by the time you move into the 1880s and 1890s, they realized we don't have to go necessarily for voting intimidation through violence. We'll use a series of other means, all politically motivated or kind of defended by politics, so through law. So you might have a tax you had to pay. Well, if you're a sharecropper who has no real cash whatsoever, you're not going to be able to pay that tax. They would have different kinds of tests in different places, some just basic literacy, some more of a political science type of test that, quite honestly, a professor like myself or a political science professor, we couldn't pass it either. You'd notice that they would recognize how unfair the system was because they would have many poor white people who also perhaps were illiterate and couldn't pass the test. So in many states, they created what was known as the grandfather clause. And that basically said if your grandfather voted in the 1860 or 1858 election, they might have had the 1864 election also, then you could vote without taking the test. And of course, you can see how racially motivated this is, because obviously very few African Americans had their grandfather able to vote in 1864. So, you know, there was a real sense in which the system was designed to limit any accruement of civil rights. And you can see here's just a picture that shows you the voting. And if you look, except for Kentucky, which is right here in the middle, here's Kentucky and Maryland, so two of the more northern states. If you look at South Carolina right over here, or Florida's right over here, here's Alabama, Tennessee's a little better. What do you see very clearly is the four bars are showing you from 1878 all the way through 1912, the total voting. And the reason voting was so high in 78 and also in 76 was because African Americans were able to vote. Republicans were able to vote. If you were a white person who believed, remember when we saw the road into the Civil War, there were many states like Tennessee and North Carolina that had very anti-secessionist groups who in 1870 would more likely have leaned to vote Republican. But by the time you get to 1890, they're not voting at all. Usually because there would not have even been a Republican on the ticket for you to even vote for. And for the Democratic Party, they would say, well, yes, nobody else wants to run. But when the message from a white person to another white person was, if you vote Republican, if you tried to run as a Republican, you're a betrayer of our race. Well, that played a significant dampening role of anybody wanting to run. And by the time you get into the 1900s, you may have known people who were, you know, many places the Democratic Party had two wings because it was the only party to run. But obviously you can see the dampening of the election turnout, which was, you know, obviously harmful in our idea of creating a more rich republic where more citizens participate. The penal system was specifically used against African Americans at this time period. You could actually buy prisoners to work on your farm, either for a long time or for at least a rented period of time. And when you hear people today, particularly among African Americans or civil rights activists, talking about the problems today, 2020, about the penal system and how we do things within our laws and our jailing system, this all goes back to Reconstruction. Because in the South, Reconstruction was designed, or what the South does, is designed in a way to be able to arrest African-American men for really just any kind of charge that had no significant bearing or standing. And then once they were in prison, they were able to then use a clause of the 13th Amendment in a way that allowed them to still basically force these people to become slaves. So the system kind of designed in a way that was harmful. Lastly, and perhaps most tragically, was that the Supreme Court failed to support Reconstruction. And from 1870 all the way through the 1890s and really into the 1950s, the Supreme Court, which was initially almost all Democrats under the remember, the Supreme Court obviously or usually is put in by a president, and then they will live 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So most of the Supreme Court members who were on the court in 1870 had been put in before Republicans were even a political party. So Lincoln does, I think, nominate 2 or maybe even 3 Supreme Court justices, but the majority were, as I said before, largely white men from the South who unsurprisingly had a specific viewpoint. And so in a series of cases from 1870 to 1880, they would overturn aspects of the Reconstruction efforts. So when you would look to the Supreme Court to try to help sustain Congress in what it was trying to do to support civil rights, unfortunately, it didn't. And the most egregious act ultimately happens with what we call the Jim Crow laws. So this term Jim Crow is centered around the case in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, but it really goes back in time. There's no clear linkage that anybody that I've ever read to say why exactly this term was used. So back in the 1830s, the beginning of the minstrel show, which involved white actors, singers, putting on blackface to then mimic African Americans. Of course, this is in the time of slavery. And so one of the most famous, and some would argue the very first, is this man, Thomas Rice. So Rice was the first who created a character for a show, and that he called Jim Crow. And he would do a song and dance called Jump Jim Crow. And it was very, very popular, both in the North and the South. And so over time, by the time you go forward 30 years into the Civil War, the term Jim Crow was often used as a code or an epithet to describe a black person, just in general terms. One of several, you know of some that we still have with us today, unfortunately. And so it was just this term that was used. And so the linkage between what becomes known as the separate but equal laws that emerged from Plessy versus Ferguson get linked back to Jim Crow. And that term of Jim Crow is really just kind of connecting, I think, mostly to the idea that the viewpoint of many was derogatory and derisive towards African Americans as a race, as individuals, as their capacity, their ability to learn, their ability to act and do, right? So in 1890, as just one of the examples of how, like I was saying, you begin to see civil rights and the denial of these rights kind of pressed into the law itself. Louisiana passes a law called the Separate Car Law. And what they wanted to do, and what they did, was pass a law which said the railroad, so again, the railroad's a critical story piece here, had to have a car, a passenger car at the end of the train for any black person. But they couldn't sit anywhere they wished. So in 1891, this was challenged by a group of men, and in a way that really kind of references what we'll see happening in the 1850s in Birmingham and in Alabama and Montgomery with Rosa Parks. These people find a way to sit in the car they're not supposed to be sitting there. Homer Plessy is the person who is arrested. Plessy was, as you can see there, and they would get into doing these kinds of mathematical formulas based on who somebody's parent was. Honestly, I always find these so frustrating to even say out loud, because as we've learned from, the DNA testing at our own time, our DNA and our blood is massively mixed. I defy anybody to tell me that they are a pure blood of anything, because if you read the history of our globe, the human species has been moving around the globe and mixing. And so anyway, but at that time, it was all about who your father was and your grandfather, and they would literally force people to prove that they could go back to their grandparents or even their great-grandparents. And so Plessy, somewhere back in his lineage, there was a black person. So he was 1/8 African-American. And therefore, by Louisiana law, he was a black person. So in any pictures that you see of Plessy, he looks kind of like I look. So he's arrested. It goes through the court system being challenged by these civil rights advocates, and they lose, of course. The law is upheld. And in 1896, it goes to the court, to the Supreme Court. And in a 7-2 vote, the Supreme Court declares that they could do this as long as they could show that they were not abrogating equality. And of course, this is where we get the very famous phrase of separate but equal. Now, from here to the 60s, nobody's really going to fight it like we see fought in the 50s and 60s with the sit-in movement. We're not talking about the modern civil rights movement today in any way. So you may remember that. You lived through it, obviously, and it became a really big deal. But it all goes back to this moment that the Supreme Court said that you could do separate but equal. For most people who have studied this and looked at it, rarely were the facilities equal. And so again, you have this feeling of the Supreme Court supporting this division of the races in a way that denies opportunity and rights to the African Americans. And throughout the country, not just in the South, you're going to see laws passed that are known broadly as the Jim Crow laws, and then specifically in other places, laws that limited the opportunity for free rights. Well, so then this makes us wonder, well, what was going on? Remember, leading up to the Civil War, the fight was abolition. And the old guard leaders, some of them still remain. You can see Douglas Freeman, he's with us up into the 1890s. And so you've got some of the old abolition leaders fighting the fight. But you need to remind yourself that abolition as a movement never really had more than 15, maybe 20%. Remember, the Republican Party failed in their 56 election and only really came in second in 56 because the other parties were disjointed and falling apart. They win in 60, not because the country in a majority agreed with abolition, but because Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Lincoln was a moderate who said, hey, you guys in the South can keep your slaves. We're just not going to let it expand. And so now, once they've accomplished with the 13th Amendment, many of them thought, okay, good, we've done our job, particularly those who were sort of just moderately, yes, I don't like slavery, but I don't really want to get involved. So then this meant that civil rights was going to turn to a whole group of new leaders. Some of you met last time, like Ida Wells. Ida B. Wells is an example of one of the new leaders. Almost all of these people were born into slavery. And there's going to be one critical example where it's not, which I'll point out to us. As you heard last time, a women's rights activist, she was an investigative journalist. And so she would go through the South and try to report in Northern papers some of the things that were happening. Very brave woman. Robert Smalls from South Carolina. He actually is considered the founder of the Republican Party in South Carolina, which was the state just ahead of Mississippi of having the most African Americans living in it. And so thus, clearly by numbers, should have been the dominant Republican stronghold in the South throughout the last 150 years. He is one of the many African American leaders elected to the House in this time period, even in the face of the opposition and treatment of African Americans. But by 1880, there's no African Americans or very few African Americans elected to the State House or to the National. Anna Cooper, a focus on education. All these people really believed in the education process. She's a sociologist. Her book, A Voice from the South, was a dominant book that kind of echoed across the country, kind of reminding people of this need for civil rights. She will become the leader of Frelinghuysen University, a small school in the North, but focused on giving African Americans an opportunity. Timothy Fortune, an editor, a newspaper man. The New York Age became, for a time, the dominant black paper would be how it would have been understood, paper supporting and try to emphasizing a civil rights journalist. He becomes an advisor to Booker T. Washington. And it is with Booker T. Washington that we then kind of run into the two key leaders in pushing the civil rights conversation. Now, at this point in my class, normally what I do is I have my students kind of work together to try to figure out, where do these two gentlemen lie? They're both educators, they're both PhDs. You know, where's the difference between Dr. Washington and Dr. Dubois? Where is that place where you can find the difference in kind of how they saw things? Because these two men, while pushing for the same aim of civil rights, will diverge in what they believe needs to happen. We'll take them in turn in their ages, though. I won't make you do that work for me. We'll kind of walk our way through it. Washington becomes the dominant figure of the latter 19th century. Washington was also born into slavery. At age 20, he will graduate from Hampton, and eventually, less than 5 years later, becomes the founder and the president of Tuskegee. Now, if you see that word normal, and there shall only be one normal, I don't know why it says normal, forget that right there with Hampton, but a normal and agriculture institute. You may remember I said in one of the presentations, I think the one we did about urban, and talking about school development, that coming into the 1880s and 1890s, there developed a posture amongst the education to try to bring colleges into the more rural areas. Schools like Auburn, University of Florida, Clemson were land grant institutions that are in this ballpark. And that's why the Agricultural Institute part is connected to schools like Hampton and Tuskegee. What about the normal? It sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? The normal school. What did we say in some other schools are abnormal? Well, we might think that about our school's big rival, that it's abnormal, but that's not what it's talking about. The idea of a normal school was what it used to be, was the name for schools of education. Basically, a normal school was a school that was designed to teach people how to be teachers, how to be educators. And this is one of the really key points to understand about Dr. Washington's viewpoint. For Dr. Washington, the focus was on education and economic development. His idea of how best to achieve racial equality would be one over a prolonged period of time in which the people, all the people, are getting educated, not just, say, the elite or the smart kid or the kid who can afford college, but that they could, all of the people, and his focus would have been African Americans, could be educated, and that then they could learn to benefit or develop their economic strength in a way that would allow them the independence from any kind of thing like the sharecropping system. Now, he'll become so well known primarily because of his speech that he gives. He becomes the first Black person after Freeman to give a speech, arguably the first in the South ever, to give a speech to a racially mixed audience when he spoke at the it's got this long title here, the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition. Basically, it was a thing that the Atlanta New South leaders like Grady put together to try to, put together a conference to bring people together and say, hey, look how good the New South is. And so they risked, these white leaders took a risk in asking Dr. Washington to come and give a keynote address. It was a big, big deal for this Black man to speak to these white people as if he was their equal, and in many cases, he would have been more educated than they. In the talk, he talks about what he called the new Negro, which I understand is a term we obviously don't use today, but this idea of that this person would learn how to live, how to cultivate the soil. Now, he gets criticized for this speech a few years later, not immediately, and Dr. Dubois will ultimately be the one who dubs the speech the Atlanta Compromise. So if you Google it, you'll find Atlanta Compromise long before you find that long title of what the conference was where Dr. Washington's giving the speech. It's called the Atlanta Compromise because for Dubois and others, it sounded very much like Washington was saying the African Americans, the former slaves, and now their children should just accept separate but equal, should just accept segregation, should just accept a different status. He might have been saying that. I think, however, though, as I point out there at the bottom of the slide, I always feel like, having read the speech, that Dubois is missing where Washington's trying to go. Because you can see what he says, that what he wants to do, yes, as Dubois criticizes him, Washington is saying we shouldn't do agitation, right? It's not going to help. It's extreme folly. However, the reason why is that we want to find the enjoyment of privileges that will come to us over this constant struggle, meaning over time. Now, it's easy for me to say that. First, I'm a white guy, so that makes it really easy. But it's easy for me to say that. The question to Washington would be correctly, I think, aimed to say, well, how long? How long do you mean? And there's no good answer for that. It's part of the thing we talked about, Reconstruction. How long would it have taken? And remember, I told you that Grant said maybe 30 years. And I argue maybe more like 60 years, maybe 80 years, 3 or even 4 generations of teaching a new way of life, not only with civil rights, but with economics and other things, education. Just remember how they were attacking the schools, because that just wasn't the way that they had done things. When you want to know why the southern states, even today, are among the least in funding for public education, you see it played out here in Reconstruction. It's that old Jeffersonian view of taxation, which is a different conversation, but I'm just trying to point out to you that there is, this legacy that we kind of deal with. Well, if you're the one being persecuted, if you're the one being denied opportunity, maybe you don't want to wait that long. And that's where Dr. Dubois is. Dr. Dubois' view is that we simply cannot wait that long. Now, he's going to have to fight the fact that Washington and the Tuskegee machine will become the dominant player. In fact, they're so dominant that even as Dr. Dubois is attacking Dr. Washington is privately funding a lot of the work of groups like the NAACP, certainly funding a lot of legal aid to African Americans who had been mistreated, who had been wrongfully accused. He'll stay at Tuskegee till his death in 1915, and will put out thousands of educators to kind of work his long-term plan of trying to bring about civil rights. You can see he was the first African-American to ever eat at the White House. So again, Dr. Washington was a powerful, powerful figure, but he wasn't above being critiqued. And that's where Dr. Dubois comes in, because he'll never be happy with Dr. Washington's viewpoint. For Dr. Dubois, and I realize for some of you may say, isn't it Dubois? It's actually pronounced both ways. He never actually says, and so sometimes I go back and forth myself. For Dr. Dubois, there's some key things to recognize about his viewpoint. One, he's the only one of these civil rights activists that we've emphasized who was not born a slave. And that's not a criticism, like he doesn't have a right to participate, but it just should be noted that contextually, he grows up in the North, where he certainly would have experienced some forms of segregation and kind of discrimination, but he did not experience what the others would have experienced in the South, where they realized and recognized if you were an uppity Black person who was speaking out of turn, you could suffer greatly even with your life. Dubois will go to Fisk and then graduate from Harvard. But in 1897, he does come south, and he actually intersects and interacts with Dr. Washington. And it was in the summer of '93, where he's teaching as a visiting professor at Tuskegee, that he really begins to butt heads with Washington. Coming from the North, where he would have had a lot more freedoms and more civil rights, Dubois simply could not accept the fact that there should be some prolonged period of waiting. He'll publish both The Souls of Black Folk and The Negro Problem in 1903. And both of these are seminal works in the civil rights conversation, in which he's raising the question of how do we move forward. Now notice in The Negro Problem, he introduces and supports an idea called the talented tenth. And so I think this is one of the key differences between him and Washington. For Dubois and others, the focus needed to be putting all the efforts in developing the best, the brightest, the strongest amongst African Americans, so that they then, as he said, could inspire the masses. Now that's not to say he did not believe in education for others, but clearly his more elitist view of the talented tenth versus Dr. Washington's more grassroots view of educating everybody, there's a clear difference that you can see there. Whether which one's right or wrong, You have to discern that for yourself. But the two men are going in different directions as the best how to get there. And ultimately, for for Dubois, his view will be agitate. We're not going to wait. And he finally, in 1905, seeks to make this happen. He organizes a group called the Niagara Movement. Now, clearly, he brings all these other people with him, right? He's not alone, right? And you heard that last time. And I'm going to show you some other names here in a moment. Or you can see some of them. Jane Addams, Ida Wells, John Dewey, many, many, many others, much like the Underground Railroad movement that we talked about, whose names are not famous. They had to actually go to the Canada side of Niagara because there were no hotels up in Niagara, New York, that would allow African Americans to register in the hotel. So again, not just a Southern issue. They go to the Canada side and they create an organization called the Niagara Movement. Now, it doesn't last, but it's the kind of genesis of what ultimately becomes the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We know it more by its letters, the NAACP. The NAACP will get its jump start out of Springfield, Illinois, which you, of course, know Springfield is the hometown of Lincoln. In August of 2008, there'll be a riot that occurs there, a race riot. It's not the first race riot in the North, won't be the last one, but that it happened in Springfield, in Lincoln's hometown. For men like Dubois and for Washington, this was really offensive. This was really egregious. So there began to be calls through the North, mostly, for a new civil rights organization that was announced on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th, and will come to fruition the following year in 1910. Dubois will become the director. He's joined by other key leaders like James Weldon, Walter White. And you can see before a decade's gone out, they've expanded. They've got branches all over. Their focus was on agitate and on the legal side. They're going to really fight down the road of lawsuits. Like I said, Dr. Washington's Tuskegee machine will actually fund a lot of the lawsuits that they're doing, as well as provide funds for Dubois. So at the very moment Dubois is kind of attacking him behind the scenes, Washington is still the funding agent because he is the most powerful. The NAACP will go on, as you and I know, to become very, very successful, and they'll continue to fight against lynching and fight for civil rights, and they're still with us today, still fighting in the organization to try to bring things around. Ultimately, for Dubois, he will find himself unhappy. So even his agitation efforts will not achieve what he believes should be achieved. For me, looking at his later life, it raises the question, if ultimately wasn't Washington right? Wasn't Washington the one that had the better view? Again, it's easy for me to say because I was not in their shoes. And I don't know what I would have said had I been African-American living at that time. I might have agreed with Dubois that I'm tired of waiting. However, we can see Dubois ultimately will part ways with the NAACP. He'll part ways with the Democratic Party, first joining Deb's Socialist Party, and then eventually he'll be connected to the Progressive Party, which we'll talk about later, and then he'll get connected to, in the 60s, the American Communist Party. He lives a very ripe age. He dies at 95, and in his latter years of life, he will renounce his U.S. citizenship and move to Ghana and become a citizen in Ghana. Well, so what does that leave us? Well, I showed you this slide before, right? This is where we find ourselves. What we've done over these past 4 weeks is we've looked at this, why the clothes don't fit right, what's going on. What we're going to do next time, though, is we're going to look and see what comes to answer this problem. So our last 3 or 4, I'm not certain yet, 3 or 4 sessions will be focused on what effort is made politically and socially to try to bring about more change to deal with these issues. And that's where we'll go in our next weeks as we continue our way through October. Next week, we'll look at the next third political party that comes along. I'm a big advocate of third parties because I often feel like the big two, and certainly in our day, I would say the big two, perhaps are missing the mark. But we'll talk about third parties next time when we look at one of the solutions coming from the West. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the West, and then we'll move our way backwards. Thank you all for being with us again tonight. I appreciate you so much, and I hope you have an amazing, amazing week. Talk to you later.